Hello, historians. This is Mr. Fredo. Today we get the opportunity in this episode to examine the form of trade that essentially replaced silent barter, and that's trans-Saharan trade. Trans, this prefix, means across, so don't make it any more complicated than it is. Trans-Saharan trade just translates to trade across the Sahara Desert. Now, saying the words is one thing, but actually doing it is completely different. Look at this just mass of desolate desert. It's horrible to even think about. Could you imagine anyone leaving West Africa today in 2016 and wandering across the Sahara Desert 1,200 miles one way to get something like salt? Absolutely not. We have apps on our phone that we push one button and we get pizza delivered. I have a coffee machine that starts my coffee for me automatically. It's ridiculous. This is a lot of work. It's an incredibly courageous effort by the sides who are responsible for the trading, but don't lose sight of how miserably difficult this was. Now, prior to about the 1000s or 1100s CE, this trade was almost non-existent because it was nearly impossible, and it's still incredibly challenging regardless of what's introduced later on that helps it become more frequent and slightly easier. But it was nearly impossible because people would have to walk that distance, and there were still massive language barriers. Two main factors changed the trans-Saharan trade from being something that could never happen or seldom happen to something that happened pretty regularly over the course of about 300 to 400 years. And those two factors are the introduction of camels and the spread of Islam. Both kind of play different roles in why this trade becomes easier and starts to happen more frequently. The introduction of camels allow people to travel faster because the camels have better endurance throughout that environment than the actual people do. The people were called porters, and that was basically a human who was responsible for carrying large amounts of good through the desert. Porters aren't needed anymore when camels are introduced because they can go faster and they can carry even more goods. So again, that's another factor. Camels increase the quantity of goods that can be traded and brought back. You're not going to make this 1,200-mile trip one way, 2,400 total round trip, just to get a handful of salt. If you're going to do it, you want to make sure that you're bringing home a large amount of that. So quantity was very important. The introduction of camels play a big role in that. Second major factor is the spread of Islam, and the main factor in how the spread of Islam creates an increase in the trans-Saharan trade is the fact that now people on both sides of the trade, North Africa and West Africa, are speaking the same language. It isn't as difficult to communicate, and it also eliminates conflict because, again, they share a common belief. So two main factors that make this start to happen more frequently than it ever did prior to about 1000 or 1100 CE. Now, in terms of what was being exchanged, at the end of the day, it's a trade. So both sides are going to make sure they're getting what they want. North Africa is going to trade or send to West Africa a couple of different items. Weapons, usually made from Europeans, so these would be advanced weapons. And then, of course, salt. The West Africans, on the other hand, they're going to take their gold, but they're also going to take jewelry that they've made. And then they're also going to take slaves, individuals from West Africa who had been captured and are then going to be traded and sold to North Africa. Now, don't lose sight of that because this is going to be an issue that comes up during our exploration unit in terms of a justification used by Europeans for the slave trade. Trans-Saharan trade becomes a very, very effective method of trade for a couple hundred years, as we said earlier, about 300 to 400 years. And really the only reason it goes out of style, and you're not going to be able to see it because of the color marker I chose, the only reason it goes out of style is because people, by the time the 1400s, 1500s come along, technology has increased to the point where they can just skip this whole process and they can trade by sea. That's called maritime trade. That's really the only reason that trans-Saharan trade goes out of style. They find a better way to do it, and both sides are still getting what they need. But again, for a long time, trans-Saharan trade across the Sahara Desert, was a very effective method of trade for both sides of that process, the North Africans and the West Africans.